everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Helen and this is Stitch Rip Repeat. So today's video is going to be all about sewing tips for beginners. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. I've had a fair few new subscribers recently, so welcome to you all. It's lovely to have you here. And I've been receiving a lot of love, a lot of likes and comments on my last two videos. So thank you ever so much for joining me, and I really appreciate the warmth I get from the community, and I'm so happy that you're enjoying my videos, and that is why I'm here again today. So the video that I'm doing today was inspired by Laura over at the Specky Seamstress. She's doing a playlist of vloggers giving tips for beginners about sewing, and I thought this was fantastic because I personally think you can never get enough help and support from people who already sew, and so I think that it can only help, and that if I can help in any way at all, even with one of the things I say, then it's been a really worthwhile video for me to do. So you have to excuse me if I keep looking down. I've got my little notebook here, and it's got my top 10 tips for sewers. So let's get started. Tip number one is all about your sewing tools. Now, it may seem obvious to people who have sewn before, but I had never sewn before until about 4 or 5 years ago. So basic tools were things I picked up as and when I would be doing a sewing project, and suddenly realised I didn't have something that was considered pretty basic. So first thing would be a good pair of scissors. So I have a few scissors. My main scissors I have are my fabric scissors. Now these are a good pair of scissors and they are specifically for fabric. So you don't have to spend a lot of money. The first pair I had was a Fiskars pair, which I think were somewhere between £8 and £12, and they were really good scissors. Bought these because they are Tula Pink, which, if you follow my channel, you know, my favourite fabric designer, and they're iridescent, so I do like a bit of bling. So the Fiskars ones were absolutely fine, but I replaced them with these. So a good pair of fabric scissors, and to use them only for fabric is a really good tip. So if you can keep them in a separate place to other household scissors and use them purely for your fabric, then they will do a fabulous job of cutting out for you. I also have then a pair of basic scissors for cutting out fabrics and anything that, for cutting out anything that isn't fabric. So my patterns, when I'm cutting things like that out, I would use just a basic pair of scissors, and obviously they're quite clearly different. And then finally I have, which you don't need to get, but these something I was given a while ago, some pinking scissors. So when you're first starting out, you may finish your seams purely by pinking so that they don't fray. I finished my seams for about a year by just pinking, and then I got myself an overlocker. So I would highly recommend getting scissors that you know will do the job and don't have to break the bank. Other tools you could have is a rotary cutter and a mat. I have this Olfa rotary cutter, and I have a couple of mats which I will show. So the mats that I have are two different sizes. One I keep in my sewing room, but I'm limited on space. So it's only a 23 by 17 inch mat, and that's this one here. No guesses as to why I got this one. Another Tula Pink. But that is always in my sewing room, but I have a larger size cutting mat which I keep downstairs and put out on the dining room when cutting larger projects. So you need to make sure that when you're cutting out your fabric, you have one of the tools I mentioned so that you can get a nice clean cut. When it comes to the difference between scissors and rotaries, I personally find that scissors are perfectly okay on my woven fabrics like cottons and linens, but when it comes to stretch, jersey, knit type fabrics, then it's much easier to use the cutting mat and the rotary cutter. But of course, as a beginner, a good pair of scissors is all that you need to get going. So along with the scissors, you might well need to invest in some pins and a pin cushion. And again, these were not that expensive, although I do recommend finding out good pins, because some pins I've bought cheaply and actually they're quite blunt, and you don't want to ruin your fabric by having a pin pull at your fabric. So just get some really nice sharp fabric pins and a pin cushion. The last thing I would recommend you would need as your tools, and I'm sorry to say we do need these, is a decent seam ripper. Now you get one with your machine, which is really basic, like a white thin seam ripper, and I mean that's absolutely fine if you want to stick with that. This one cost me like £3 I think in one of the supermarkets, and it's got a much better grip, and it's got a lovely little lid to make sure you don't stab anything. And this I find works really, really well, and unfortunately have to say gets a lot of use. So that's tip 1, is having your sewing tools ready. Top tip number 2 is thread. Now this may seem a really obvious tip, but you need to get decent thread. So obviously you need thread, and sometimes it can be one of the things that people think, well, I'll just get the cheapest thread. But I would highly recommend getting a good quality thread, because if you've spent the time and effort and money on a pattern and fabric, you don't want to then ruin it with having inferior thread. So I tend to go with Gutermann's, and they have a big range of colours and you can get them pretty much everywhere, and they're not that expensive. So a decent thread for your machine, and that will then make sure that it doesn't mess up your project with one of those inferior threads. They can fluff and break easily, and we want a nice, good, strong thread. Tip when it comes to the threads as well, which I didn't know, forgive me, when I was starting out, because it's just one of those things, is match your bobbin to your thread. So if you have a reel like this, you would fill up your bobbin with this and then use it for your thread as well. So thread, tip number 2, make it a good quality one. Top tip number 3, now this is a contentious one, so this is just my personal feeling about it, is that if you are going to make something, and if especially it's quite a well fitted garment and you want it to stay as it was when you sew it, I would really highly recommend pre-washing all your fabric. So I didn't wash all my cottons when I first started sewing because I was using them for bags, so there really is no need. But I find when I started with sewing garments, that you really want to make sure that if they're going to shrink at all, they do it before you make your item. Ask me how I know. So again, it's my personal opinion, and some people don't think that you need to, and it's totally up to you. But certainly with stretch fabrics, I find that they can shrink on the first wash and sometimes on a few subsequent washes, and you would hate to make that lovely fitted top or fitted skirt and then wash it and find it doesn't actually fit anymore. And as long as you're making it for yourself, putting it in the wash is what you're going to do anyway regularly, so why not do it when you first get your fabric? So that would be my top tip number 3, pre-wash your fabrics. Top tip number 4 for me is needles. Now, call me daft. When I was first sewing, I got a little pack of universal needles. Now, to me, I thought that meant they would sew everything. And when I was sewing up something that required top stitching, I couldn't get the top stitching to work. It was skipping and it was breaking, and I really didn't understand why. And the reason why is you need to have the right needle for the job. So your basic needles that come with your machine are perfectly good for general woven fabrics, but if you're using a jersey or a knit fabric, then you will need a jersey or a ballpoint needle, because they are specifically designed for working with that fabric. Equally, if you are top stitching or using a heavier, like making jeans, there's special needles for that. You would need a top stitching or a jeans needle. And if you're totally unsure, have a look up, and they have sizes on them. So for instance, I have all my needles here. So my universal needles that I first got were assorted. So heavier fabrics would use, and I hope I'm right saying this, the higher number. Where is it? And the lighter your fabric, the lower the number. If I'm wrong about that, I'll correct myself. But those were universal, as I say. However, I have now got jersey needles. So obviously there, as I say, for my jersey and my knits. I've also got top stitch. And also because I made them recently, I have jeans needles. So I have all the needles I need, and I would highly recommend before starting a project just double checking that you have the correct needle to make sure that your project goes smoothly. So that's top tip number 4. Top tip number 5, patterns. So when you have your pattern, it can be a bit overwhelming. If you've never read a sewing pattern before, as was the case for me a couple of years back, they can really, well, stress you out a little bit that you don't really understand. Basically, I would suggest reading everything on the back of the packet first. So just one second, I'll get a pattern so that I can explain. So this is one of my Tilly and the Buttons fabric patterns, sorry. And as you can see, obviously it tells you the name, and it tells you the, so it shows you what the pattern looks like on the front. And sometimes they have, like this one, a couple of different versions. Sometimes they can have 3, 4, 5 different versions that you can make, and they'll all be included in that package. But on the back, they have more helpful information for you. So you have line drawings there that show you how the garment is designed. And then you have your body measurements. So with those body measurements, you'll be able to work out which size you're going to make. And then once you've done that, it will have a supplies list, which will tell you how much fabric you need. So that, and it tells you, like some of them do, especially Fabulous Tilly. She's really good for being, she actually tells you which type of needle you require, like I was just saying. So for this one, she says you need a ball point or a stretch needle because you're going to be sewing this with knit fabric. And the last thing, if you're unsure of as a beginner, is what type of fabric. It can be very overwhelming, I know, if you go into a fabric store or you go online and there's all the different categories of fabric. And if you're anything like me, you just look at the print and think, oh, I love that. Oh, fantastic, I'll get that. Which is a mistake I made and why I have such a huge stash of fabric. What you really need to do, if you're being sensible, is look at the fabric suggestions that you will always find on your pack. And so we've got them here. So for instance, Tilly says here, light to medium weight knit fabrics. And then it gives a few examples. So all the information you need is on the back of the pattern. So do not panic when you're buying your pattern and you're not sure what fabric, how much fabric or anything like that. You can work it all out from the pattern packet. So that would be my top tip, is take your time and make sure before you start anything, you know what you're doing, and that's all based on the information on your pattern. So that was my top tip number 5. Top tip number 6 is trace. Now, this is something that, again, not everybody does, and I'm not saying you have to, but personal experience for me was that when I first started sewing, I was a couple of stone lighter than I am now, and I happily cut away the size that I required and made up one garment. And then now, further down the line, I can't use my pattern because I've cut away the larger sizes which I actually need. So I found this was a bit of a learning curve, and I know there's other people out there that are the same. So now I always trace my patterns. Now you can use lightweight paper. So if you can see through it, you can just do it directly onto paper. I use this Swedish tracing paper. Now, I discovered it earlier last year. It's a fantastic product because it's very firm, it's very stable, it's not likely to rip. But if you want to as well, you can actually sew up your toile using the pattern fabric if you want to try out different things. And that's rather than using your fabric to do testing of adjustments and changes. But that's probably something you would do later down the line. I personally, as a beginner, would just stick to the pattern, and that tracing paper, it comes on a lovely big roll, and once you've traced off the pieces, it means you can pop them away and you've got them for future reference, but it still means you've got an intact original pattern. So if you're anything like me and you go up and down in size, then you won't have to trace it again. So this step is quite time consuming, and it's not my favourite part of sewing, but honestly it's so worth it. If, for instance, you've paid out for an indie pattern 14, 16 pounds, you know, it's a really great way of knowing that you'll be able to get multiple items out of that one pattern just by tracing. So that is my top tip number 6. Top tip number 7. Testing the stitch before you sew on your actual garment. Now, this is something I learned after getting really frustrated with a few of my first items, because I got my pattern pieces ready and I pinned them together and I thought I'll stitch them up. I started stitching and it was all over the place, skipping stitches and not sewing neatly and all sorts of problems. And eventually I realised that the key to this is just to always have a little bit of scrap of the fabric you're going to use. So when you've cut your pattern piece out and you've got those spares, keep those spares, because when you're going to do your seams, and especially if it's anything that's going to show like top stitching, you can test out the stitch length and the tension on that piece, and when you're happy that it looks good and it's sewing well, then you can use that on your actual garment. It just saves a lot of heartache of having to rip out stitches and start again, simply by testing it and setting it all up before you stitch up your garment. So that's my top tip number 7. My top tip number 8 is to follow things like YouTube. Honestly, if you can, they are fantastic. They have tutorials for pretty much anything. So when I started sewing was when I made toys for my children on my embroidery machine, like these little rabbits. However, the whole pattern, fabulous about embroidery machines, was done on the embroidery machine, except for that final seam, because obviously once you've cut it all out and it stitched it together, it would leave a little gap so that you could stuff the toys, and then it would say hand sew the seam. And this was my first real experience of having to ask. And so all I did was I looked up on Google how to hand stitch toys shut. That told me I needed a ladder stitch. No idea what a ladder stitch was. So I looked that up and it gave me loads of tutorials over on YouTube. And because they're visual, it's really fantastic. I found them so invaluable. I still do everything on YouTube. If I'm not sure about anything, YouTube is my go-to. My other suggestion would be to ask on and join lots of Facebook groups about sewing. They're always more than happy to help people out, and you'll find an absolute wealth of advice from experienced sewers on there. And no question is a bad question. If you don't know, just ask. Don't ever be afraid to ask. That's how you'll learn. And we're still learning now. So my number 1 tip would be always ask, and my number 1 place to do that and get the answer would be YouTube. Top tip number 9 is when you've done all this and you're sewing your garment, take it slow. So a lot of machines have a speed control, and hopefully I'll show you on mine here. Mine has a little switch across button from the slowest to the fastest, and whether I'm using the stop start button, which I love because I don't have to use the foot pedal, or the foot pedal, it will limit the speed. And this is fantastic, honestly. There's no race. You don't have to do it in double quick time. I first used to beat myself up when I started sewing because I'd see all these people sewing really quickly and producing garments left, right and centre. And I'm lucky if I produce one in a couple of weeks. But do you know what I've realised is that it's okay. It's okay to sew slowly. All you want is a lovely garment. And if that means you're unsure about something and you take it slowly, then do it. It's absolutely fine. And sometimes you'll find when you get a bit of confidence, or you've got a certain seam that's quite straightforward and a long way, you might speed it up and it'll go through. That's fine too. Whatever you need to do to get your garment done, nobody's watching you, nobody's timing you. If you want to take your time, take your time. And if you want to hand crank round corners or anything you're worried about, do it. Nobody's going to criticise, nobody's going to know, and you will end up with a fabulous item of clothing that you have made. So take it slow is one of my top tips. And then finally, top tip number 10 is enjoy. What is the point of us doing this sewing and getting all this lovely fabric and these lovely patterns if we don't enjoy making them up? If I don't enjoy sewing, I take a break. I don't want to start really not enjoying it and feeling like it's a chore. It's actually my little escape, and I love to sew. And so I would highly recommend that you enjoy the process, you enjoy what you made, and you enjoy showing it off. I put a little label in these days that will say me made, or I made this, or yes I made this, because I'm proud and I've enjoyed it, and I've got, at the end of the day, a really fabulous garment that is all mine, and I know that I put in the effort, I put in the time. So why not really make the most of that? Enjoy your sewing. And that's it. So I hope you've enjoyed my top tips, and if you've got any tips of your own, and I'm sure there's loads of you out there, that you can pass on to me or anyone else watching this video, do pop them in the comments for me. And if you haven't subscribed to me yet, please do click that subscribe, making sure you tick on the bell so you don't miss any of my videos. And I will see you in my next video.